The heat that afternoon lay heavy upon the town of Red Hollow, pressing down like judgment from a merciless sky. Dust rose in lazy spirals from hooves and boots, and every window shutter seemed half closed against the glare. At the edge of Main Street, where the gallows shadow cut across the packed dirt, a wagon rolled to a stop. Upon its splintered boards stood a boy, no older than 17, wrists bound with frayed rope, sunburn peeling across the back of his neck. His name was Eli Carter, though no one there cared to ask it. The auctioneer, a narrow-faced man with a red neckcloth, raised his voice above the wind. One strong hand for labor, good with horses, docile as they come. His words rang out like hammers striking tin. The crowd, ranchers, drifters, and desperate townsfolk, murmured and laughed. A few coins clinked together. Eli kept his head bowed, eyes on his bare feet, dust coating his ankles like rust. $5, someone called. "6?" shouted another, a man smelling of whiskey. A woman spat in the dirt. "He's just a boy." The sheriff stood nearby, hands resting lazy on his belt, saying nothing. Law here served those who could pay for it, and the auction block had seen worse than this. The sun slipped behind the steeple for a moment, painting the boy's shadow long and thin. He thought of his mother, her face a blur of tears and hunger, selling him for the promise of a loaf and a coin. The auctioneer's gavel hovered mid-air. "Sold to 10, came a woman's voice. Clear, low, certain, heads turned. From the edge of the crowd stepped Clara Vale, her black dress hemmed with dust, a widow's veil drawn back from her face. She was not young nor frail. Her eyes, gray as rain about to fall, met the auctioneer's without flinch or apology. "I said 10, she repeated. The gavel came down with a crack. "Sold to Mrs. Vale," whispers fluttered like dry leaves. The Vale widow bought herself a servant, or company, someone muttered with a smirk. But no one dared speak too loud. Clara's husband had once owned half the valley before he'd been shot off his horse by rustlers. Her grief was legend, her silence even more so. She stepped forward, unknotted the rope from Eli's wrists, and handed the auctioneer a leather pouch. Then turning to the boy, she said only, "Come." Eli followed her through the murmuring street, his steps uneven. She didn't look back to see if he kept up. Her wagon stood waiting by the trough, 2 chestnut mares restless in the harness. The sun was sliding west, bleeding gold across the prairie. As they rode out, the town shrank behind them, its shouts fading into wind. The land beyond was vast and empty, rolling sage and mesquite, the smell of dust and sun-cracked earth. Eli sat rigid beside her, unsure if he should speak. His wrists still burned from the rope. After a long while, Clara broke the silence. "You know ranch work?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Good. You'll sleep in the barn till I find your measure." Her voice carried no cruelty, only habit, the way people sound when they've been alone too long. They reached her property at dusk. A wind-worn house with a porch that leaned slightly east. A barn of gray wood and fields fenced but half fallen. The scent of old hay and smoke drifted from the chimney. As she climbed down, Clara paused, scanning the horizon as if expecting ghosts. Then she handed Eli the reins. "Unhitch them. Water first, then rest." He obeyed without question. When the horses were settled, he stepped into the barn. Light filtered through the slats in gold stripes, catching on dust motes that drifted like tiny souls. A cot stood in the corner, a thin blanket folded across it. Beside it, on a small crate, rested a tin plate covered by a cloth. He lifted the cloth to find stew, warm still, thick with potatoes and venison. Hunger clawed at him, but he hesitated. It felt wrong to eat something meant for a free man. From the doorway, Clara's voice came again. "Eat, then rest. Tomorrow we work." Eli turned, startled. She stood framed in the fading light, her veil now gone, streaks of gray glinting in her hair. There was no softness in her face, but no malice either. Only a quiet weariness, as if she carried her loneliness the way others carried guns. "Yes." "Ma'am," he said. She nodded once and left him to the dark. That night, wind moaned through the cracks in the barn, carrying the scent of sage and rain far off. Eli ate slowly, tasting salt and warmth for the first time in months. When the bowl was empty, he sat on the cot and looked toward the house. one window glowing faintly behind the lace curtains. Somewhere inside, the widow moved, her shadow pacing the parlor like a restless ghost. He wondered why she'd bought him. Pity, labor, some unspoken grief only he could fill? He didn't know. All he knew was that she'd spoken to him like a person, not property. That alone felt like something sacred. As the moon rose, silver over the plains, Eli lay back on the thin mattress and listened to the night breathe. Crickets, the distant bark of a coyote, the creak of the old windmill. Each sound felt heavy with meaning. He thought of the men who'd laughed at the auction, of the sheriff's indifference, of his mother's silence as she'd walked away. Bitterness threatened, but exhaustion was stronger. His last thought before sleep came was a simple one. Tomorrow, we work. And though he did not know it yet, tomorrow would be the beginning of his becoming. The slow mending of a life torn apart by cruelty, stitched together by the unlikely mercy of a widow who'd long forgotten how to hope. Emotional tone and realization, loneliness and guarded compassion. In the quiet meeting of two wounded lives, one hardened by loss, the other stripped of innocence, the first fragile thread of redemption is spun. Beneath the dust and silence, mercy stirs. The days settled into a rhythm as steady and silent as the ticking of the mantel clock inside Clara Vale's house. Morning light broke pale over the hills, gilding the frost that clung to fence posts. Eli rose before the sun each day, his body aching but obedient, his spirit half waiting for the lash that never came. He mended fences, drew water from the well until his palms blistered, and learned the soft economy of her ranch, when to let the horses graze, when to pull the weeds before they strangled the corn. Clara rarely spoke, yet somehow he understood her rhythms the way one learns the moods of weather. When she appeared in the doorway of the barn with her shawl wrapped tight and a kettle of coffee in hand, he knew the day had begun. The ranch was a world of small sounds, the squeak of the gate latch, the creak of saddle leather, the far cry of hawks circling high in the blue. To Eli, every sound was a kind of mercy. There were no drunken shouts, no boots stomping down cellar stairs, no chains dragged across dirt. Only the wind and her voice, brief, calm, sure. Inside her house, the air smelled of linseed oil and quiet memory. Her husband's rifle hung above the hearth, polished, though unused. A single framed photograph sat on the mantel, a man in uniform, young and proud, his arm around a woman who was clearly her, years younger and smiling. But there were no other pictures, no laughter, no traces of a family's life. Once, while stacking chopped wood, Eli caught sight through an open door of a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The lid was half open. Inside, white lace spilled out, a wedding dress, yellowed with time. The sight filled him with a strange, hollow ache. He worked harder after that, as if effort could pay back the kindness she never mentioned. At supper, they ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoon against bowl. She'd sometimes pour him a second helping without looking up. He always murmured, "Thank you, ma'am." And once, she replied softly, "Eat, you'll need strength." Her tone was not warmth, but something close to it. At night, Eli lay awake in the barn staring at the rafters. The wind slipped through the boards, whispering like voices he could almost name. His dreams were full of the past. The men who'd bought and sold him, their faces red from drink, their laughter cutting like broken glass. In one dream, his mother's hand released his, her back turning toward the road. He woke with a start, breath ragged, the taste of dust and tears bitter in his mouth. That morning when he sat up, he found a folded wool blanket at the foot of his cot, clean, freshly mended. No note, no words, but he knew whose hands had left it there. He pressed his fingers into the fabric, surprised at the lump rising in his throat. Days turned into weeks. His scars, both the visible and the buried ones, began to fade, replaced by calluses and quiet steadiness. Sometimes he caught Clara watching him from the porch as he worked, her expression unreadable. She'd lost a son years ago. The townsfolk had said so. A boy drowned in the river after a spring flood. Eli didn't know if the rumor was true, but he saw in her eyes that she carried a sorrow too deep to name. When Sunday came, the bell from the church in town echoed faintly across the hills. Clara never went. She'd stand on the porch, hands clasped before her, eyes fixed on the horizon as though she prayed to the open land instead of any god. One afternoon, a neighbor rode up, Mr. Avery, a stout rancher with kind eyes and a talkative mouth. He tied his horse by the gate and tipped his hat. "Heard you took in a drifter boy, Clara," he said, half smiling. Got the whole town whispering. Clara's lips thinned. "Let them whisper." Avery chuckled uneasily. "I meant no offense. Just thought you might need help keeping him in line." Her voice was like ice. "He's not trouble." Eli stood nearby, a bucket of feed in hand, trying to make himself invisible. Avery glanced his way, nodding as though inspecting livestock. "You keep your manners, son." "The widow here's done you a favor." "Yes, sir," Eli murmured. When the man finally rode off, the silence that followed was thick. Clara turned to Eli, her face pale but steady. "Don't let gossip reach your ears," she said. "It feeds on weakness," he nodded. "I won't, ma'am." She hesitated as if wanting to say more, then simply turned back toward the porch. He noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she smoothed her shawl. That evening, the wind carried the smell of rain. Clouds stacked like bruises over the hills. Eli stabled the horses, checked the tools, and paused outside the barn to look toward the house. Through the lace curtains, he saw her silhouette in the rocking chair by the window, moving slowly back and forth, the chair creaking like a heartbeat against the hush. He didn't know what she thought about in those long hours between dusk and dark. Maybe her husband, her son, her past. Maybe nothing at all. But he felt deep in his bones that her silence was not emptiness. It was survival. And in his own silence, he understood her better than words ever could. That night, sleep came easier. The dreams still lingered, but softer now, like ghosts too tired to haunt him. When he woke before dawn, the blanket she'd left kept him warm. The world outside was cold, but the barn held a small, living heat, the kind that comes from being seen, even if only through the eyes of another wounded soul. By the week's end, Eli had begun to hum as he worked, tuneless, quiet, but steady. Clara heard it once and paused in the doorway, her eyes shining with something she didn't let herself name. It was not joy. It was not grief. It was recognition, the echo of life returning, slow and stubborn, to a place that had forgotten its own heartbeat. Emotional tone and realization, stillness and reflection. The shadows of their separate griefs begin to overlap. Clara's silent motherhood, Eli's lost innocence. Through simple acts of mercy and unspoken understanding, they start to see that sorrow, when shared, softens into something like grace. By late October, the wind had turned cruel. It came down off the northern ridges carrying dust, sleet, and the smell of something metallic, the scent of winter before it broke. The days shortened, the sky hung low and gray. Even the horses grew restless, stamping at the earth as if they sensed what was coming. That afternoon, Eli was hauling a wagon load of hay from the field when he saw the first bruise of black clouds rolling over the hills. The air tightened, the stillness thick as held breath. He dropped the reins and ran for the barn, shouting to the horses. Thunder cracked, and the wind followed, sharp, slicing, lifting dust into a furious spiral. He worked quickly, guiding the mares into their stalls, tying them firm, then securing the feed doors before the rain could drive through. Each motion was muscle memory now, learned from Clara's sharp instruction and his own quiet determination to be useful. Lightning tore the horizon open. The land glowed white for a heartbeat, then fell back into shadow. Inside the house, Clara had lit the lanterns and drawn the curtains against the storm. She was used to the wind, to its loneliness, its warning. Yet that night, something in it sounded different. It wasn't just weather. It was an omen. A knock came at the door, hard, impatient. Clara froze, hand tightening around the match she'd just struck. Few men came this far out unless they wanted something. The storm howled against the walls as she opened the door. A man stood there, slick with rain, hat pulled low, a badge dull with rust on his chest. Deputy Benson. "Evening, Clara," he said, his voice carrying the drawl of too much whiskey and not enough peace. Heard tell you've taken in company. She didn't move aside. You heard wrong. His grin showed yellow teeth. You always were proud, but pride won't keep this place from rotting under the snow. A woman alone can't manage land like this. Your husband's gone, God rest him. Time you sold or found a man who can keep it. Her hand steadied the doorframe. I manage fine. Do you? He leaned closer, rain dripping from his hat brim. Town's talking, Clara. About that boy you bought at auction. Pretty strange, you keeping him here. Before she could answer, Eli appeared behind her, wet from the rain, hair plastered to his forehead. The horses are secured, he said softly, not looking at the stranger. Benson turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. So it's true. He spat into the mud by the porch. You're feeding strays now. Eli straightened, hands trembling at his sides. I work for what I eat, sir. The deputy barked a laugh. Sir, he says. You teach him manners, Clara? Her voice cut through the rain, low and sharp. You should leave, Benson. He didn't. Your husband was my friend. I'm trying to keep you from ruin, or worse. Lightning flashed. His face caught in it for an instant, every scar and cruelty etched in stark relief. You'll regret this charity, he muttered, stepping down from the porch. Women like you forget where kindness leads. Then he turned and mounted his horse, rain drumming on his shoulders as he rode back into the dark. The storm broke open after that, thunder splitting the sky in furious shouts. The house rattled, the barn groaned under the wind. Eli, soaked to the bone, returned to the porch, hammer in hand. The shutter beside Clara's window had torn loose, slamming against the wall with every gust. Without a word, he stepped into the rain again. Leave it till morning, she called. He shook his head. It'll tear clean off. The nails bent beneath his shaking fingers, but he kept at it, his thin frame outlined by flashes of lightning. Clara watched from the doorway, the way he pressed against the wind, the way he refused to yield. Something in her chest ached, a memory stirring. Her late husband doing the same years ago, before the fever took him. The same stubborn resolve, the same fight against the storm. When he finished, Eli turned back, rain streaming down his face like tears he didn't know he shed. She stepped forward, holding out a wool coat, her husband's old one, kept folded in a chest for years. Take this, she said. He hesitated. It's not mine. It is tonight. He took it carefully, almost reverently. The fabric was heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. He slipped it on. The sleeves hung long, the shoulders broad. For a moment, it felt like armor. Not against the storm, but against the world that had once stripped him bare. Thank you, Mom, he said. Clara nodded and turned away before he could see her expression. Inside, she set another log on the fire, her hands trembling. The storm outside screamed against the walls, but inside the small house, a fragile warmth began to grow. Unspoken, uneasy, but real. Later, when the thunder faded to distant grumbles, Eli sat on the porch beneath the coat, watching the rain run off the eaves. He could see her shadow through the window, seated by the fire, hair unpinned, her face softened by lamplight. He thought about the deputy's words, about being called a stray, and felt something rise in him that wasn't shame this time. It was resolve. Whatever this place meant, whoever she was, he'd earn his keep here. Inside, Clara stared into the flames, her husband's ghost flickering in memory. Once, she'd believed she could never trust another soul again. But that boy, that quiet, haunted boy, had stepped between her and a man she'd feared since widowhood began. No one had done that since her husband's death. She breathed out, a long, trembling sigh, and for the first time in years, whispered into the firelight, "Thank you." Outside, Eli didn't hear her, but he felt something shift. a weight easing from the air, a silent permission. He leaned back, letting the rain soak into the earth, and closed his eyes. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the land washed clean and shining under a pale new light. Puddles mirrored the first streaks of sunrise, and from the barn came the soft sound of horses stirring, alive, unbroken. When Clara stepped out onto the porch that morning, she found the coat folded neatly on the railing, still damp, but carefully placed. Next to it, a note in uncertain handwriting. Didn't tear the shutter again. Thank you for the coat. She smiled faintly, the expression foreign on her lips. Then she folded the note into her pocket, the weight of it warmer than the coat had ever been. Emotional tone and realization, tension and quiet courage. The storm mirrors their turmoil, Clara's fear of intrusion, Eli's struggle for worth. Through danger and defiance, they begin to share something deeper than duty, a silent loyalty, born in thunder and sealed by mercy. You. By the first breath of winter, the hills around the Vale Ranch had turned the color of pewter. Frost clung to the fences each dawn, and the wind came whispering through every crack like a lonely spirit searching for warmth. The barn could no longer keep the chill at bay. When Clara found Eli's cot rimed with frost one morning, she said nothing at first, just looked at him, his hands stiff with cold as he struggled with the morning chores. That evening, while stirring the fire in the hearth, she spoke without looking up. The small room by the kitchen's empty. You can take it till spring. Eli froze mid-step. Ma'am, I can stay in the barn. You'll do as I say, she interrupted softly, her tone more weary than stern. The cold kills faster than hunger. No sense tempting it, he nodded, quietly grateful. That night, he moved his few belongings, a folded blanket, a book with half its pages missing, and a small wooden cross he'd carved himself, into the little room. The space was narrow and plain, smelling faintly of coffee and dried herbs from the kitchen beyond. Yet to Eli it felt like shelter in more ways than one. From then on, the rhythm of their days changed. They shared the same roof, though often in silence. In the mornings, Clara brewed coffee at the stove while he split logs in the yard. The light that filtered through the window between them turned everything gold for a few fleeting moments. Sometimes their eyes met through the glass, hers lined with time, his still unsure of his place, and both would turn away quickly, pretending to busy themselves with work. As the weeks passed, Eli's frame filled out with labor. His voice deepened. His movements grew certain, measured. The boy who had once flinched at every loud sound now walked with quiet steadiness. Clara noticed these changes against her will. Each day she saw more of the man he was becoming, and each day her heart wavered between pride and fear. She feared the town's whispers most. The women at the mercantile already looked at her with thin smiles, the kind that cut deeper than knives. She'd overheard one of them once. The widow Vale's got herself company now. Young and strong, too. She'd said nothing, but that night she worked later than usual, her hands raw from scrubbing the table. Eli had found her there, pale under the lamplight. You should rest, he'd said softly. Mind your chores, she replied. But the sharpness in her tone trembled. He obeyed, though he lingered at the door a moment longer, watching her shoulders shake with the effort of holding herself together. It was not long after that the fever came. At first she brushed it off as fatigue, refusing to slow her pace. But soon her skin flushed with heat and her steps faltered. When she finally collapsed at the table one cold evening, the spoon clattering from her hand, Eli was there to catch her before she struck the floor. Mrs. Vale, Clara. He said her name without thinking, the first time he ever dared. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, her breath shallow. He carried her to her bed, the same one that had once held her husband's fading life. The fire had burned low, and the house smelled faintly of pine smoke and sickness. For 2 days Eli barely slept. He brewed broth, fed her by the spoon when she could swallow, and wiped her brow with a cool cloth. When she muttered in feverish dreams, he listened quietly. Once, she whispered her husband's name, James. Then, as if realizing her mistake, her hand reached for Eli's and held fast. He didn't pull away. He just sat beside her, his thumb brushing the edge of her knuckles like one might touch a fragile relic. Her skin was hot, her pulse faint but steady. By the third night, the snow began to fall. It came softly at first, then thick, steady, relentless, white burying brown, forgiveness over grief. Through the window, Eli watched it cover the world while Clara slept fitfully beside the dying fire. When she woke at dawn, her fever had broken. The room smelled of pine ash and coffee, and Eli sat slumped in the chair, his head resting against the bed frame, asleep at last. She watched him in silence, her hand still loosely holding his. For a moment she didn't see the boy she had bought from a wagon. She saw instead the son she'd lost, the man she'd buried, and the quiet strength that had somehow found its way back into her home. Later, when he woke, she tried to speak, but words failed her. Gratitude, shame, affection, they all tangled in her throat. So she said only, "The kettle's cold." He rose, rubbing his eyes. "I'll fix it." The day passed slowly, filled with soft sounds, the clink of wood against the stove, the hiss of water boiling, the whisper of snow against glass. Clara stayed wrapped in blankets near the fire while Eli worked around her, careful not to disturb the peace that had settled between them. That evening, as she sipped the broth he'd made, she looked at him fully for the first time since the sickness. His face had changed. The boyishness was gone, replaced by something solid, something steady. "You did right by me," she said quietly. Eli looked up from the fire. "I only did what anyone should." Not everyone would have. Their eyes met then. No fear, no pretense. Just two souls who'd spent too long in silence, finding, at last, the comfort of being seen. When she finally rose to retire, she paused in the doorway and said, "You'll want to check the barn roof in the morning." "Snow's heavy," he smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am." After she was gone, Eli sat by the hearth a long time staring into the flames. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender soap and cedar. He thought of how close he'd come to losing her, and felt something stir in him that frightened and steadied him all at once. Outside, the snow thickened. The world was muffled in white silence, every harsh edge softened. From her room, Clara listened to the sound of the wind easing, the faint echo of his footsteps in the kitchen. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the blanket sink deep into her bones. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of graves or loss. Only the sound of the fire and the steady breathing of the house that, for all its ghosts, felt alive again. Emotional tone and realization, slow-burning warmth beneath the hush of winter. Guilt, tenderness, and fragile understanding intertwine. In the nearness of sickness and care, both Clara and Eli discover that love can exist quietly, unspoken, unclaimed, but no less real for its silence. By early spring, the land began to thaw. The river behind the ranch cracked open its icy shell, and green shoots pushed stubbornly through the mud. Clara watched them from the porch some mornings, wrapped in her shawl, coffee cooling in her hands. The world looked alive again, but she didn't trust it. She knew peace on the frontier never lasted long. Eli had healed well from the winter's chill. His shoulders were broad now, his back straight from months of hard work. When he smiled, on the rare occasions he did, the lines of fear around his mouth softened. Sometimes, she caught herself smiling back before she even realized it. But the peace they'd built was fragile. The town's whispers hadn't died. A widow and a boy, now a man, living alone together was enough to stir talk uglier than dust storms. And word traveled fast across the plains. It was a bright morning when trouble came. The sun was high, painting the world in gold. Eli was mending a fence near the barn when the distant echo of hoofbeats reached him. 3 riders approached, one in a tan duster, the other 2 rougher, faces shadowed beneath their hats. Even before he saw the lead rider's smirk, Eli knew who it was. Deputy Benson. Clara stepped out from the porch as the men dismounted. The same calm steel that once defined her husband's presence now ran through her voice. "You've got no reason to be here, Benson." "Reason?" Benson spat into the dirt. "This land was James Vale's, a good man, God rest him. Shame to see it fall into ruin, and worse company." His eyes slid toward Eli, full of disgust. You replaced him with this stray boy? Folks are talking, Clara. Ain't decent. Eli tensed, fists curling at his sides. Clara's chin lifted. You'll watch your tongue on my property. Or what? Benson sneered. You'll sick your little servant on me? Eli took a step forward before he could stop himself. You need to leave. The deputy laughed, the sound mean and sharp. You best mind your betters, boy. Something in the way he said it, the same tone Eli remembered from the men who once beat him, made the air snap. He lunged. The hired men moved faster. One swung his rifle butt across Eli's jaw. The crack echoed off the barn wall. Eli hit the ground hard, blood spilling down his temple. Stop it! Clara shouted, running toward them. That's enough. Benson caught her by the arm, grip rough. I'm giving you a chance, Clara. Sell me the land. You can keep the house. Maybe even keep your boy here if that's what you need to sleep at night. Her fear turned to fury. Take your hands off me. He laughed again, but the sound died when he saw what she was holding. Her husband's rifle, the same one that had hung above the hearth since the day he died. She held it like she'd held his memory, steady, trembling, determined. Get off my land, she said, her voice low, shaking with rage and something deeper. Now, the hired men froze. Benson sneered, but his hand slipped from her arm. You wouldn't dare, he muttered. The hammer clicked back. I buried one man I loved, she said. Don't make me bury another kind of sin. The silence stretched. Then Benson spat again, motioned to his men, and mounted up. You'll regret this, he said, turning his horse toward the road. Both of you. When they rode off, the only sound left was the wind whistling through the barn slats, and the soft crackle of the lantern swinging nearby, flame flickering gold in the dust. Clara dropped the rifle and ran to Eli. He was sitting upright now, blood streaking his temple, his breath ragged but steady. She knelt beside him, her trembling hands brushing dirt and blood from his face. You're all right, she murmured, though her voice trembled. He blinked at her, dazed. Did you shoot him? She shook her head. Didn't need to. He tried to smile, but it came out weak. Good. For a moment neither spoke. The golden light from the lantern cast their shadows long across the barn floor. Clara's breath hitched as she looked at him, the boy she'd bought from shame, now a man standing between her and ruin. Her fingers lingered at his cheek, the warmth of his skin grounding her. No one will ever sell you again, she whispered. His eyes flickered open, and in them she saw both pain and something that looked dangerously like hope. That night the house was silent. Eli slept in his room, his head bandaged, while Clara sat alone in the parlor. The rifle rested across her lap. Her hands still shook from the memory of holding it. The fire in the hearth burned low, its glow painting the walls in amber. Above the flames hung the wedding portrait she'd kept all these years, herself in white, beside a man whose eyes still haunted her. She stood, crossed to the closet, and drew out the cedar chest. The smell of old wood and lace filled the room. Her wedding dress lay folded neatly inside, untouched for years. She ran her hand over the fabric, fine once, yellowed now, and felt the tears rise before she could stop them. You'd have told me to be strong, she whispered to the memory of her husband. I hope I was. She laid the dress into the fire. The flames licked at the fabric, curling it inward until it glowed and crumbled. The scent of silk burning was strange, sweet and sorrowful, like something sacred ending. She didn't look away. When it was done, she added one last thing, the black veil she'd worn to his funeral. It went up fast, like paper. By the time Eli stirred and came to check on her, the fire was dying down. He saw the ash, the rifle on the mantel, and the calm on her face. Everything all right, ma'am? He asked quietly. Clara turned toward him. Her eyes were tired, but free. Yes, she said. Everything's right. Outside, the night hummed with crickets and the scent of rain. For the first time, the ranch no longer felt haunted. The house that had been a tomb now breathed again, alive, forgiving, new. Emotional tone and realization, cathartic and redemptive. The storm of violence gives way to stillness and truth. Clara releases the ghost of her past through fire, reclaiming her life and her will. Eli, defended not as a servant but as a man, finds his worth restored. Together they rise from the ashes, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two souls reborn through courage and compassion. Weeks passed. The prairie rolled green again, stitched together by rain and sunlight. The air smelled of mesquite and wild mint, and the creek behind the barn ran clear enough to see the pebbles at its bottom. Each dawn found Clara and Eli already at work, she mending fences, he hauling feed, both moving in the same quiet rhythm that spoke of understanding deeper than words. The lawmen came 3 days after the fight. 2 of them, dusty, polite, curious, asked questions in the parlor where the smell of smoke still lingered faintly from the burned wedding dress. They listened as Clara told the story straight. Trespassers came, tempers rose, rifles were drawn, and mercy won the day. Eli stood nearby, his head bandaged, eyes steady but distant. When she finished, one of the deputies leaned his hat against his chest. "Sounds like justice found its way without us, ma'am." Clara nodded once. It did. They left her with a quiet nod, spurs jingling on the porch. By the time the dust from their horses settled, she and Eli were alone again, and the ranch, for the first time in years, felt wholly theirs. The days that followed were honest ones. Fences rebuilt, the smokehouse repaired, the porch repainted under long afternoons of light. Clara found herself humming sometimes, an old tune she couldn't remember learning, while Eli worked nearby, sleeves rolled, hands sure. The silence between them was no longer uneasy. It was companionable, filled with the small music of labor and life, the creak of the gate, the brush of straw, the whistle of wind through the open barn door. At night the house glowed warm again. Clara read by lamplight. Eli fixed tools by the hearth. Sometimes they shared a quiet supper, bread, beans, and black coffee, while the crickets sang beyond the walls. Once he asked softly, "Do you ever miss him?" "Your husband?" She looked into the fire for a long time before answering. "Not him so much as the way I was when he was alive. Young, certain. I miss believing the world was something you could hold in both hands." Eli nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I used to think the same, that it belonged to other people. Not to me," she smiled faintly. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I think it's something you earn, one day at a time." She reached out, touching his arm, just briefly, enough to steady herself. "You've earned yours, Eli." The weeks slid into summer. The grass turned gold under the sun, and the long shadows of the barn stretched toward the horizon like reaching hands. Clara began to notice small things, how tall he'd grown, how sure his movements had become. He no longer carried himself like a boy waiting for permission to exist. He was a man now, one who had known cruelty and chosen decency anyway. One evening, she found him in the barn, oiling the old saddle that had belonged to her late husband. The smell of leather and oil filled the air. "That saddle's seen better days," she said gently. He smiled without looking up. "So have we." She laughed, a soft, startled sound that felt strange and good. "You're not wrong." He hesitated then, setting down the rag. "I think it's time I move on, ma'am. Head west. There's talk of ranch work near the San Pedro. Maybe even land of my own, if I can save enough." Her breath caught, though she'd known this day would come. "You've got a home here." "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why I can leave." She looked at him, really looked. The boy from the auction was gone. In his place stood someone whole. The scars on his hands and the line at his jaw told the story of everything he'd survived, and everything he'd become. She nodded slowly. "Wait here." When she returned, she carried something wrapped in cloth. She set it down before him and unfolded it carefully, revealing her husband's saddle, freshly polished, brass glinting in the lantern light. Eli's eyes widened. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," she said firmly. James would have wanted it used, not gathering dust. "You've earned your own right, Eli Carter. Take it and go with your head high." For a long moment, neither moved. Then he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed the worn leather. "You gave me more than a home, Clara." His voice was barely a whisper. "You gave me my life back." Her throat tightened. "You gave it back to yourself. I just gave you room to do it." He smiled. Then, a rare, full smile that caught her off guard. At dawn, the horses stood saddled. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet grass and new sun. Eli swung into the saddle, adjusting the reins with easy grace. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl tugged by the wind. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that didn't need saying. Finally, Eli tipped his hat. "Goodbye, ma'am." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart wasn't. "Ride safe, Eli." He nodded once, then turned the horse toward the open plain. The rising sun spilled gold across his path, lighting the dust that rose beneath his hooves. Clara watched until he became a shape against the horizon, first clear, then fading into the shimmer of heat and distance. Only when he was gone did she breathe out and let the shawl slip from her shoulders. The porch creaked beneath her bare feet. She looked toward the barn, the fields, the quiet home that no longer felt like a tomb. Life pulsed through it again, soft, steady, forgiving. For the first time in years, she felt no ghosts watching her. Only peace. She turned and went inside. On the mantel above the hearth, the rifle still hung, but beside it now rested something new, a single braid of horsehair, bound with a strip of leather. A reminder of mercy given and received. Outside, the wind stirred the grass, whispering its long hymn across the valley. Somewhere far ahead, a young man rode toward the horizon. Not a servant, not a slave, but free. And on her porch, the widow who'd once lived only for the dead finally smiled, faintly, bravely, knowing that love, even when unspoken, had done what it was meant to do, make them whole again. Emotional tone and realization, bittersweet peace. The story closes not with romance, but with renewal. Dignity reclaimed, wounds healed, and two souls once broken now complete. Their bond lingers like sunlight on the horizon, tender, fleeting, eternal.